Hello, and welcome back to Wired for Change. I'm your host, Amy Yee. Imagine you're sitting around a leadership table and everyone's heads are nodding and everything seems great. And maybe you've just, set something up and it's wonderful. And everything's high energy. But over time, something seems to happen. Um, and that something is something we'll talk about today, which is leadership team drift. What happens when the numbers roll in and maybe there are missed targets or people are just waiting for a meeting to end so they can go back to doing their own thing? It's very easy for something like that to happen, particularly in transformation. It's so hard to keep everyone's kind of head in the game and to even notice when maybe you've got a little bit of that leadership drift. I think that's a challenge that many senior leadership teams face, today, and it's something that isn't always talked about as well. It's that alignment, especially when things get messy, when priorities start to collide. How do you get out of that? You start to look at, perhaps, is it this person or is it that person in particular? Maybe if you get rid of this person or that person or remove them from the table or change rules for people, maybe that will fix things. But is that the problem? Is that the entire problem? Is that going to change things for the team and for your way forward in navigating? We are very fortunate to have Michelle Chambers here with us today. Michelle is a thought leader and very experienced in terms of organizational design and working in a number of different areas, right now. And we're going to talk through some different scenarios, what it looks like to recognize some of those challenges, what happens when you get to the messy middle, and then what it looks like when things are starting to fall back on track, and maybe some techniques and tips on how to do that as well. So, welcome, Michelle. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, Amy.
Me too. Maybe you can start by telling our listeners a little bit about your background and what you do.
Sure. So I technically started off with an HR background, went into organization development change. I did a master's in workplace learning and change, and I was hooked. And the work we do, as you know, Amy, is incredibly hard. It's messy. It's all about people. It isn't just about metrics at the end, it's all about people. And I think that's what really encouraged me to do additional training in terms of coaching and team coaching, appreciative inquiry, and looking at different processes like polarities and managing complex systems change. So I actually do support a program through Schulich as well. It's a master's certificate in organization development and change because I believe that we really need people, especially in these complex times, who understand that change isn't just change management. It's all about leading change and supporting the leaders. It isn't just about the strategy, but it's how we implement the strategy. So, pleasure to be here.
Amazing. And, I just was thinking about the whole idea of change leadership, and I think it's become a bit of a buzzword. Maybe just define that a little bit for some of our audience who might not be as familiar with change language.
Fantastic. Sure. Well, I think when we talk about change, almost everyone refers to change management, and they often refer to, Cotter's model of change. They often refer to um, ProSci or ADGAR model of change. And so those are very comprehensive change management toolkits, if you like, especially for project managers. But what we forget about is we need to support the leaders in terms of developing strategy and how they're going to support that change. And that's where working with senior leadership teams, particularly coaching them while they're managing a transformation, can be really helpful because we coach them in the nature of their work while they're doing it. And in particular, when we look at systemic team coaching, we look at coaching the entire team as a whole. The team's our client. We don't coach the individuals, we coach the collection of individuals as a team. And we help hold them accountable and we help support them in particular as they're either integrating a new member of the team, maybe they're developing a strategy and they need to execute on it. Maybe there's a transformation because there's been a merger and acquisition. There's a whole lot of scenarios that come up. But as you know, particularly when we look at leaders at the top, it can be a very lonely type of role. They often don't have colleagues to share expertise with around leading change. And we often don't dedicate enough time to the process. We really drive on execution, particularly North American society. Everyone jumps to the task, and we don't talk about how we're going to lead that change effectively.
Well, it feels like friction, right? You want to get started, and then it's like, hold on, we need to talk about this. But it's true though, people miss that. So that's great. Sort of look at the landscape of what leadership is dealing with and teams are dealing with. So let's frame the problem a little bit. I guess in terms of alignment, I think that what is alignment when leaders think about it, and then what is often missing. So people will think of alignment in a certain way. We've all got the same document, so we're aligned, for example, and maybe you're not. So what's the gap here?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think one of the things that you mentioned is there's this pressure to start off and to produce results very quickly. And so, for example, even when someone's communicating what the strategy might be, even if they've co designed the strategy, which is the ideal, so they should be aligned because they co developed it. But if the strategy comes from up top, then people are less likely to be aligned and they shift from the purpose. So I think to be aligned, leadership teams need to really first of all, align what is their unique purpose, their unique value proposition in the organization. What is it that only that leadership team can do? And then they need to align on, okay, what is the strategy or the objective, that we're looking to achieve? And then they need to align on how we're going to do that. And even though there may be a lot of conversation up front, I find most teams don't do that. They really jump into the execution stage because there's all these pressures, either coming from board members, environmental factors, perhaps other stakeholders. And with that pressure, we tend to jump to the task. And when we do that, we forget about the process. And in particular, leadership teams need to develop a positive culture as to how they're going to work together.
What does that positive culture kind of look like? Sort of, you know, one day in versus maybe 6 months in versus maybe a year in.
Yeah, it's well, I mean, I think probably a lot of your audience, they've probably been on a high performing team, for example,
Mhm.
right? And when we've had that experience, unfortunately, we tend to have the opposite experience more often. But let's assume a high performing team. They're adding value. People want to be part of that team. The organization's buzzing about that team. There's positivity in terms of how the members treat each other on the team. There's respect. There's trust. There's even a sense of camaraderie, like they belong to something more. They're excited. They're looking forward to going into work. And I think they feel that collectively they're adding value, not just individually, but collectively adding value to the organization. They're connected with the purpose. And I just wrote an article last night for Choice Magazine
Mhm.
on unleashing collective joy. And I think joy would be a great word to describe, that positive culture that we want to create. Because when we're in that place, then we can even handle the demands and the pressure. I mean, we can do that for a much longer period of time. But unfortunately, as you know, even a high performing team can burn out. You can't operate in that mode all the time where you're just focused on the execution. And that's where we end up with the low performing teams that we've seen. And so, just to give you an example,
Mhm.
this was actually one of my first team coaching clients that I had, and this is going back a while. But the new director, they'd had four VPs, and they'd had four VPs in 4 years. And this was a senior leadership communications team for a major municipal government organization. And think about communications. They're an integral part of the organization, right? They're assisting all of their, departments, all of their stakeholders in developing communications that ultimately go to the community, to the public. So transparency is really important, and you want to make sure they're well written. And this communications team, the leader contacted me and she said, look, she goes, we are not performing. No one's even contacting us hardly to work with them. She goes, I just stepped in. They've told me they've done all these leadership offsites, all these leadership 360s. They were at the bottom of the bottom. And the only reason that people weren't leaving the team, guess what? They had a great pension plan. And so people were staying, which was contributing to the negative environment. And they had a major transformation happening in the organization that they needed to address. And so communications was going to be a really key part of it. And so that's an example of a team that when they're at their lowest point, not only do they have a low cause positivity in terms of their culture, but they're not producing what they need to do. And in fact, this organization was even thinking about outsourcing the function entirely,
Mhm.
which you wouldn't do because that's integral in your organization. But the reality was all of their clients within the organization, all their stakeholders were already outsourcing. And that's why they weren't being connected and working on those central communications.
Mm.
So there's an example of a team that has definitely gone adrift. And it was great opportunity because through 12 months of team coaching, and so that systemic team coaching of working with them as one unit, we started off with a team effectiveness survey because I wanted to see, like, I believe every team has some positivity in it. And you don't want to just start addressing the problems, and you want to make sure that you've got feedback from the team. And so we actually did team coaching. So they had a first day where they created team purpose, they created team norms. They didn't even have team agreements. And here's an interesting story. So normally team agreements takes about 45 minutes to do. And this team took over an hour and a half just to decide what they were going to name it. Is it going to be team norms, a team contract, team agreements? I was going crazy, right? I'm like, oh my God, what am I doing wrong? Something I'm doing wrong. And then I thought about it. And I'm like, this is a communications team where words and language are really important. But it also said to me, wow, this is a team that has a hard time making decisions. They're
Mhm.
not aligned on things. They may have conversations, but they don't know how to deal with differences and come to agreement and alignment on something as simple as team agreements. So how are they going to handle major decisions? So that was an interesting starting point. Anyways, through the team coaching process, they had monthly coaching sessions, and some of those things came up. Is it a question of the structure of the team? And so, do we need to perhaps bring in someone new? So they did. They brought in someone new from another organization, which was huge in terms of setting some positivity and giving them someone to work with. Also, the leader was extremely strong.
Mm.
And to be honest, she actually had a social work background. And when I heard that, I was like, oh, thank God, because I'm probably going to need counseling after this engagement and this change initiative is done. What it meant to me was she understood the concepts of how people need to work together productively, right? Different from my background, but she understood the basics. She was really committed to the team. And I'm really happy to say at the end of those 12 months, they did do some restructuring, but more importantly, they worked around their key purpose because even an effective leader, when they communicate strategy, and when we're going through major change initiatives, we often say you should communicate 5 times more than you do.
Mhm.
But when you're involved with it, you already think you have already had a chance to process it a lot, but other people haven't. And so they needed to cascade that strategy down throughout their teams, and that hadn't been done well. And so this was the type of thing that we needed to address. Wow, if they're not even communicating within their own teams well. Oh, by the way, they had an integration of 2 teams to become a communications team as well. So,
That's even more.
just add a little extra into it to make it a little more interesting.
Mhm.
By the end, they did become a high performing team. They created their own service delivery transformation. They executed well on it, and they rebuilt the trust within the organization so that basically each of their stakeholder groups was coming back to them because they'd seen the hard work that they had done, and they had communicated and worked with those stakeholders to get the feedback from them as to why they weren't working. So some of those engagement scores were really, really low, and they had to work really hard on turning that around and doing a lot of feedback and data collection around their services and the way they provided them.
Wow, thanks for that story. I appreciate it. Given I'm just thinking about the trajectory, so we've got the idea of drift, right? Is there a and this team was able to kind of recover and re-strengthen itself and refresh itself. Is there ever kind of a point of no return, you think,
Yeah,
for
it's a great
teams?
question. Yeah. Well, honestly, I think this team, had they not gone through team coaching, there would have been a point of no return.
Mhm,
This team wasn't in a position to enable itself to perform differently, right? They
mhm,
really need the reflections of a coach, the interjections and interventions of a coach, challenging them. Is there a point of no return? That's a good question. I've never run into a situation where we haven't been able to turn things around through team coaching, anyways, as an intervention. I think there's a lot of challenges, especially when you're looking at major transformations in large organizations, where it just stalls and people get stuck. And most organizations have way too many priorities out there. And then it becomes, people start to shift priorities and they don't know how to balance that and they don't know what's expected of them. And people get burnt out.
mhm.
And sometimes people even start looking for other jobs in other organizations. And, so I think there's a point of no return for certain individuals. And then I think, the leader of the team, has to be able to recognize what's going on, what's happening. And as we know, not all leaders are strong leaders.
Mhm.
And so if that leader isn't strong in terms of understanding people dynamics and the challenges facing that leadership team, yeah, I think there is potentially a point of no return without another intervention. And sometimes, as you said earlier, that intervention is to change someone on the team. And that's not always the right solution.
No.
Um, I often find that it's much more complex than one person. In fact, if a leader tells me, we need team coaching. Oh, by the way, I already know what the issue is. There's performance issue with somebody. And I'm like, well, first of all, team coaching is a developmental initiative and you should be performance coaching that individual. I can coach you on how to do that, but that's not the reason for team coaching. But I believe that that presents challenges in and of itself. And I've been there. I've been there where my role was downsized and I was like, what's going on? And how do you manage that? And it sucks, to be honest, right? When you're on that receiving end and you start thinking about what could I have done differently, and the dynamics are complex. And yes, if someone's doing a really poor job and they're not meeting the expectations, then potentially changing someone may work.
Mhm.
On the other hand, it's often not the solution. And I'll share a like story. So I have a son who, both my sons play competitive hockey and went to junior, and
Mhm.
and he's a goalie. And so it's like pulling the goalie when the goalie's doing a great job, but the team's not playing well. And it sends a message to the team. Well, we're going to change the goalie right now because you guys just aren't, doing well. And here's the message. And it's not fair to that goalie who was doing well. Um, but so people have different approaches. And yeah, I think sometimes there is a point of no return. And sometimes it's the leader of the team
Mhm.
that needs to be coached
Mhm.
or needs to be changed as opposed to another member of the team.
Mhm.
And so, for example, right now, with the complexity, uncertainty we have, those leaders who are stronger in what I would call a heroic style of leadership, they think they have all the answers, they're more controlling, they're more directive. They're not going to do as well as those who are embracing more what we call the collaborative style of leadership. And they're acting as coaches or leader as coach, where they're asking their team questions. They're trying to get a better understanding. They're not making assumptions. They know they're not going to have all the answers. And with the amount of uncertainty, then how do we as a team manage that? How do we manage that polarity of the complexity and the pressure of getting things done?
Yeah.
Sorry, I kind of had a long
No,
spiel
that's
about that. You might have a few opinions about that.
there were so many things that I wanted to pick up on along the way, but I've forgotten them all now. What? But I think that one of the key points is really that it's very hard for a team to facilitate this on their own. That having that external kind of support to help facilitate whatever needs to be done or to have those conversations is so important. Um, so I did want to go back and pick up on, this whole idea of, the drift and to think about, well, how do we recognize some of those early signs of drift? And you mentioned like some leaders, are not perhaps as adept at recognizing it as some others with a social work background, for example, might be. What are some thoughts that you have on how to recognize some of those signs?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And some of the things that definitely emerge if you're kind of outside in looking at a team, um, drift to me would be signaled by people who are not engaged. They're not showing up at meetings.
Okay.
They're not participating in conversations. They're not adding or challenging viewpoints. There's a lack of psychological safety and trust, even in the room. And that happens more often than not. Um, Perhaps there's a higher absenteeism rate, or people are struggling with their performance on a particular project when they didn't before. So I think those are some of the key signs that I would say, this team's adrift here. And unfortunately, this relies on our human behavior because even when we do things like engagement surveys, oh my gosh, by the time they get those results out and they do something about it, it's often a year later and the teams have already changed. And it's not direct feedback around particular teams. It's too general. It's more about a larger division. And yet you could have a high performing, high value creating team within that division, and they're told to do all the same things as every other team because that's what the engagement survey said. So, I think this is where we need to train leaders and to cultivate expertise in that in an organization. And as you said, certainly someone internally who's able to facilitate those conversations. And I don't mean team effectiveness training because that's
Mhm.
like a workshop
Okay.
and or a retreat and you send people off, they teach them the skills and we expect them to apply them back in the workplace. Some of it's applied. What I mean, and this is a newer intervention,
Okay.
is team coaching because now you have a team and while they're doing the work, you're coaching them on it. So for example, let's say a leadership team has a really key decision to make. And we know from their effectiveness assessment that decision making is not a strength for them. Well, then, as part of the team coaching, we would invite them in and say, what's a real decision you have to make? And we're going to observe you and we're going to coach you as you do that. We're going to give you feedback. We're going to reflect back what we're seeing. And we may even have to provide you with some tools. And we may have to challenge you to have a difficult conversation, for example, and teach you how to do that in an effective way so that the team is innovative and creative and they feel good about their decisions walking out. So, and I
Mhm.
lost track of my point where we were going. Sorry.
Not at all, not at all. I mean, it sounds like there's significant onus on the leader to recognize and to know when outside intervention and help is needed, or when the team you isn't hitting their goals, and maybe, you've given them enough freedom to do that, but it's still kind of not happening. As a team member, on that team, when you mentioned earlier how people will be looking for other jobs, for example, because they don't feel engaged, or it just doesn't feel very good, for them. I think they're trying to look at, well, what can they control, right? Because everything else feels so out of their control. What can they control? Well, they can control whether or not they work here, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what kind of advice would you have for someone who's a member of that team who recognizes that there's drift, that this isn't working, what and feels like they don't have any control over the situation? What can they do to, what are some things that they can do to try to help the situation before it becomes this, I've got to go. That's the only thing I can control. This is not going to work.
Yeah, no, and I've been in that situation myself. I've changed organizations. I mean, we all know that partly why we're engaged in organizations and we're connected to purpose is because we work for a good leader. What we do, the purpose is critical. It, resonates with our values, and we work with other good people. But when one of those three things is outside of our control and it's not optimal, it makes it more challenging for us. So I would always encourage people to reflect back and think about how might they have contributed to what's existing. We have something called the 2% rule, and it's easy for us to blame others. And that's what we're kind of hardwired to do. We often blame other things or blame, something in the environment of causing something. And that's not the solution really. But think about the 2%. So, okay, if we didn't have 100% accountability, but could you own just 2% of that? What may you have done to
Mm.
contribute to that situation? So I think that reflection is important too. I think self awareness as a team member is important. And then I would encourage that person to have that difficult conversation with their leader. And it's really hard to share your feelings, to be vulnerable, especially if you don't have a leader who's empathetic. So if you have someone who's very high on IQ versus EQ, that's a really tough situation. But I always encourage people to do what they can. And then if they make a decision to leave, then they know they've done everything they can. So have the difficult conversation, share what you're feeling, share what you're noticing on the team, ask them if they've observed any of that. Maybe even in a team conversation, bring it up while the team's around. Look, I'm noticing we seem to be arguing a lot and we're not reaching, consensus on a decision. Or we're not feeling good when we leave these meetings, or we're just overwhelmed with priorities, and encouraging others to share that too. Um, that may feel like it's outside of your control. And for some people, that may be really difficult to have that conversation.
Mhm.
So, yes, I would always encourage somebody to be aligned with their values and to consider a change in job, maybe just in the organization if it's a larger organization, if that's possible. But more often than not, people often will look outside an organization. Um, but I think we all have to be true to ourselves, and we have to be true and aligned to our values too. And otherwise, and that's the whole reason I got into HR, because even back in the 80s, I remember some research saying back then, like about 80% of people didn't like their jobs. That's when we had 8-hour work weeks, not like 8-hour days, not these 60-hour work weeks that we're all doing.
Right.
And I thought, that's insane. Why would you stay with a job if you don't like it? Now, of course, I was being naive. I was an undergrad and I didn't understand the pressures of, like, perhaps you're committed to a mortgage, other payments, loans, if you got kids in university. Hence, it might not be so easy to switch jobs and roles and whatnot. But really, that's what motivated me to get into this field. And I think it's because, a lot of people aren't happy. And now what we've got is people who are job hugging. I just read that term. And
Job
so,
hugging?
job hugging. So
Okay.
before we had a lot of movement, right?
Yeah.
Particularly post COVID and with hybrid arrangements. Now what they're saying is people are job hugging because we're in a recession or almost recession economy. There's a lot of uncertainty with organizations. And so they're just staying on with the job. So when you step back and you look at that, I mean, it's not good. It's not good for that team member. And it's certainly not good for the rest of the team in terms of their productivity and their positivity, right? So, yeah, that's what I would do. I would encourage that person to reflect inwards first,
Mhm.
have that courageous conversation if they can, but in the end, be true to themselves. And I think when you know you've done everything you could, then I think you also know that, if you've made that decision to move on, that's a good decision at that point.
Agreed. And what is the impact of having a lot of people who might be job hugging, for example, on a team where they're just hanging on to their jobs, but they're also, drifting? Um, is there an impact, there in terms of the productivity and reaching your goal? Does that make it easier?
Absolutely.
Does it make it easier to find alignment if everybody just really wants to keep their job, or does that
Mm,
actually make it harder in some ways?
Maybe a false sense of alignment,
Hmm.
because I really think if a lot of people are looking for jobs, then they're not committed and they're not truly aligned to the purpose.
Hmm.
And or maybe they've never even had that conversation. What is our purpose? And they haven't had conversations to align around goals, for example. Maybe goals have been imposed on the team. And and so that creates, that feeling of frustration. And I think when you've got a lot of people looking, obviously the productivity is going to be down, right? Because they're just not as committed to it. They're not aligned in terms of their values. They're not aligned in terms of purpose. They just don't have that energy, to engage with the rest of the team. And then what happens is oftentimes people find out and they talk to each other. Well, I'm looking for a job. Did you know so and so is
Hmm.
looking for a job? And then that grapevine can actually magnify the poor morale on a team.
Hmm.
And that's, I think, really difficult, right?
Absolutely. How about the role of culture? Are there cultural blind spots for some organizations where it makes it harder for them to have those conversations, maybe, or to speak up about things. Is that does that
Yeah.
play a role
What
in
do you think
drift?
of? What do you think of when you're talking about cultural blind spots? Let me understand your interpretation first. And
I think that, they may be, habits or behaviors that people have where it's not encouraged to ask questions, for example. And so, because no one's asking questions, then we assume that there are no questions. And then people go on with the story that's playing in their
oh
heads. And
yes,
then
the
it can
too
be
nice
easy.
culture that exists. That's what
Right?
I call it. And
There's
and,
it.
and you know what's really interesting here in Canada, we're known for being very, very polite, right? And we often create this nice culture because we don't want to oppose anyone. We don't want to critique somebody's opinion. We're worried about how they're going to feel if we don't agree with them, particularly if they're a more senior leader. And it's really interesting because I often get called in to coach in global organizations where leaders come from another country. Let's say it's Greece or Italy, for example. And those were some of my best friends and still are growing up. In those cultures, they're encouraged to have a healthy debate and they don't take things personally. And it contributes to new ideas. But here in Canada, as a most part, a lot of organizations are too nice. In fact, I'm going to share with you I have a global pharmaceutical organization that we've just been brought into, and they've restructured the organization. And so they've asked us to basically work and to help launch 15 teams in that division so that they can be much more successful in terms of partnering with their brands. And one of the things they did was they created this role called illuminators for the leads of the team. And this is a highly metrics,
Yeah.
organization. I just love that name, first of all. But they purposely chose to hire externally rather than to choose people internally. Because one of the things they want to do is they want us to help support that illuminator to produce positive conflict and to challenge
Ooh.
assumptions being made. So I'm like really excited by this, right? Because this isn't something we often encourage people to do. In fact, I often think if people had better conflict resolution skills, I could be out of a job. This is something we should be teaching children, right? Like more often. Because think about it, if children learn these skills of how to have productive conflict in grade school, then I think we'd be much more adept when we get to organizational life. And that's a challenge for us. So in this organization, they're making an intentional choice right from the beginning to provide support not only to the leaders of these teams, but to the entire teams too, where they're going to be offering systemic transformation. And we're going to be bringing in teams together so that they get opportunities, first of all, to talk about their purpose. And then halfway through, the launch, we're going to be bringing them back to say, now, how aligned are you with the purpose now? And we're going to have what's called a constellation exercise, for example. And so we put down the purpose statement on a piece of white paper on the floor. And then we ask everybody to stand around in the room as to how closely aligned they are with the purpose now. And then you start to debrief from, the inside out, because those are closely aligned. You check in with them. Well, what's encouraging you to be aligned? What do you like about the purpose now? How has it been continuous for you? Then you start to get out to talk to the others. Why aren't you aligned now? I haven't heard much communication. I don't feel like I have support. No one's even talked about our purpose, and we got so many priorities, haven't even thought about it. I'm on these other projects. And so then it becomes, what do you need to do, and what does this team need to do to recommit to its purpose, right? So these are experiential ways of checking in as opposed to analytical thinking. We need to get people moving and feeling what they need to do, seeing, being, doing. And so that alignment opportunity does exist, but a lot, like I said, these are newer interventions. And if we don't produce positive conflict because there's a lack of psychological safety, and let's just define that quickly for your audience.
Yes.
So psychological safety, Amy Edmondson is probably best known for doing this, as well as Google and their research projects that they've done internally. But Psychological safety means you should be able to put up your hand and ask a question. You should be able to offer a different viewpoint that would be accepted. You should be able to make a mistake and learn from that mistake. Oh my God, a failure, right? And so I often look at the word fail as first attempt in learning.
That's a good one.
And I love that because you know what? We're human. We all make mistakes. We should have the opportunity to learn for that. But because we don't build in reflection periods, we don't build in opportunities for people to actually learn for their mistakes. We get this culture of where, people just, they don't feel safe to even express a concern. So if we're not expressing concerns and moving that information up through the organization, then they truly are blindsided as senior leaders too. And they've created a culture where, as you said, it might look like, oh, yep, we're all aligned because no one posed any challenge
Wow. That's
to what was
great.
being said, right?
That's super.
Yeah.
I love that example with the illuminators. Thank you so much for
Yeah,
sharing that. That's
no,
very
yeah.
cool. I love how, you've got the word now in there, right? Which implies that time has passed, right? Which is such a factor, and everyone experiences that differently. And also what you said about well, I haven't, like, somebody, a stakeholder saying, well, I haven't heard about the priorities in a while. So, it's such a subtle drift that can happen when it's just simply that the message hasn't been talked about in a while. It's been, a few months, whatever that cadence or rhythm is. It's easy for people to start to wonder and then to start to drift without even perhaps realizing it. And the leader certainly doesn't know because maybe they're busy executing on on whatever it is, right? And
Well,
they
you know
and in
what?
their head
Yeah,
it's very real, but they just simply
yeah.
haven't said anything or reinforced it, and somebody is taking that for drift. That's how they're seeing it. So
Yeah,
interesting.
and I've been there myself, right? Leading larger scale projects. In the end, in the beginning, you're excited. You feel like you're on top of everything, and then it's easy to go adrift, as you said. Multiple priorities to focus on, and in your mind, because you've got everything lined up, you think you've communicated it, you think everyone understands. It's easy to see it happen. And so that's why, having a team coach, oftentimes, particularly for like a digital transformation, I know you've been involved in those,
Mhm.
um, particularly when it's really important to the organization. In other words, if the risk level is high, if it's not successful, then that would be where it would be really helpful to bring in like a team coach to make sure that the team is focusing not only on the work itself, but focusing on themselves and how they're developing together to do that work. And part of that is paying attention to the system. But I've been there. I never had a team coach with a lot of transformations I led. People may not have shared things. It wasn't my intent. I always said, I have an open door policy, that type of thing. But people get busy. And if you don't have an opportunity to check in with your team, or you're not making those intentional opportunities to debrief after a meeting, even something simple like a stop, start, continue,
Mhm.
what do we need to keep doing, what's working well, what should we start doing, or those types of interventions. And most leaders aren't trained on this.
Mhm.
And that's the problem. There used to be 20 years ago, there used to be organizations that had OD/OE, so organization development slash organization effectiveness roles, and they would work with the leaders. But again, when organizations start to downsize, what's the first area they start to address? HR. They often cut back in that area. Yet we all know that, retaining institutional knowledge, developing knowledge capabilities and transformation capabilities is huge. So then why are those always the first areas cut, right?
Right.
And sometimes those people haven't made a good enough argument as to how they're adding value to the
Mhm.
organization.
Mhm.
So I would say that existed 20 years ago, but I think people have gotten better at doing that.
Mhm. Mhm. So we talked about the problem and we've talked about some ways to steer back, on course. But of course, once you steer back on course once, it doesn't mean that you'll never drift again. I was thinking about, when you're driving at night and you're really tired and you start to drift a little bit, right? You get back on,
That's
but
a great
but then
metaphor. I love that.
thanks.
Yeah.
But then, like 15 minutes later or an hour after you had another coffee, maybe you start to drift again, right? Um, do you feel like it's a muscle that a team can develop so that the next time they can recognize it faster and maybe self-correct a little bit more quickly, and then eventually you get to a place where you're almost never drifting, kind of thing, because maybe you found the right coffee with the right dosage of caffeine to keep going. But just to be able to recover faster and then get to that, wonderful goal that they're all trying to get
Oh,
to,
I'm
and get to
so
a strong
glad you
team.
raised that up because, yes, I do believe it's a muscle. In fact, the neuroscience supports
Hmm.
that if we intentionally make efforts to change behavior, we'll get there. But here's the challenge: human beings are hardwired to avoid change. We automatically bring in our flight or fight response. So it kind of sets us up at a disadvantage when change starts to happen. Many of us resist it right away. However, we can train ourselves as a team, for example, to recognize the signs of when we might be starting to go adrift. If we build in intentional processes to check in, how are we doing in terms of our engagement? What's working well, what's not? Then we can recognize those symptoms faster and recover from them faster. In fact, as a team coach, that's what I do is I train them to recognize those symptoms and I give them the tools so that they can get better and more quicker and efficient at dealing with them. Because eventually, my job, I'm working myself out of a job, right? Like in the end, what I'm doing with the team is I want them to be sustainable as a team themselves. And we're handing over that sustainability by the last coaching session. So, yes, I think you're bang on. Teams can develop that muscle.
Amazing. And imagine, if they do move on to another organization, I mean, they would take that with them and hopefully recognize that sooner and be able to help their teams in their new organization a little bit as well. So, what a wonderful muscle to develop, and it's really terrific to think about, like, what can happen for a team, and that it's not hopeless, and it doesn't have to be a drift that becomes a spiral, right? There's a
Yeah.
lot there. Any, last, like, thoughts or words of advice, for folks just as we wrap up the episode?
I think there's a couple of things that I might offer
Mhm.
is particularly if you're a leader of a team or you're part of a team that's engaged in a significant transformation, pause before you jump in to the executing of it and really make some intentional efforts to focus around your process. And if you can, employ the services of a team coach. If this is a really large strategy, it's a really critical one for an organization and the risk is really high. If you can't, that's okay. But I still think every leader needs to build in that intentional time. And part of this is even just intentional time to build connection and relationships.
Mhm.
And when we went hybrid, people forgot how to do that. And
Mhm.
so they forgot that even when we're working, say, over Zoom or Teams like you and I are, that it's important just to stop, check in. How are you doing? What was your weekend like? They just jump to business.
Mhm.
And when we're not making that time to build relationships, and when we're not putting intentionality in terms of um, interventions such as developing team agreements to help us give each other feedback on how we're supporting and behaving with one another, we're not aligning around a common purpose. And this is a big one. Almost every team that I have given a team effectiveness or a team diagnostic to, I ask the question, can you share your top 3 strategic priorities with me? I never get more than 10% alignment, which that says something to me right there. So if you can build in evaluations or even pulse checks for your own team, encourage your team to be open with one another and especially you. Cultivate that psychological safety, but you can only do that when you build the relationship and build trust. It's not something that's just going to magically appear. And I think, for yourself as the leader is stepping back too and saying, what am I doing to contribute to a positive team culture to enable us to be productive? And if I don't have those skills, then I have other leaders on my team, for example, that I can tap into to help build those skills. Um, and that's the benefits of having diversity in your team, right? As opposed to recruiting or
Mhm.
hiring people that are like you, which is a natural tendency. Again, the research shows it. Those would be some of my key suggestions. Really be intentional. about building that positivity, building the psychological safety, and building opportunities for people to develop relationships.
Thank you so much for that, Michelle. Really good, concrete takeaways that people can reflect on and think about in terms of their engagement and participation and what they can do to help support the team as they move forward in complex times, as you said. And a great, reminder that we're not wired for change, which is why I've called this podcast "Wired for Change." So, thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who's listening to the podcast. And if you are interested in change or going through change of your own, we just want to empower your effectiveness and success. And I would encourage you to subscribe and pick up nuggets along the way. All right. Thanks very much. And that's another episode of Wired for Change.
Thank you, Amy, for inviting me. And it was a great session. Love the name Wired for Change.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Take care.